If you've been following me at all on social media, you may have noticed this post right here. In that post, I was talking all about the differences between acquiring a single family residence versus a fourplex for investment purposes. And in fact, it is actually easier in a lot of circumstances to acquire the fourplex than it is the single family. First and foremost, it's important for us to discuss the different types of properties that exist. Now, ultimately, there are a lot of different types of real estate investments out there. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're only going to be talking about two general categories. Category one is residential property. Residential property is that property in which individuals will reside. Commercial property is the second type of property. Commercial property are those properties in which business operations take place. Now, residential property is going to be typically zoned as residential by the local municipality, and commercial property will be zoned for commercial use by the municipality. When it comes to the discussion, though, there is also this very interesting situation where even residential property could potentially be considered commercial. And that happens when the amount of dwelling units in a particular property exceed 4. So if you have 5 units or more, that property, even if it's being used for individuals to reside within, that property is going to be considered a commercial property. 4 units or less, as long as individuals are residing there, it will be considered a residential property. Now, there is something interesting to note. If it is a hybrid, meaning it's a mixed use property where the property is both residential and commercial, so long as at least 51% of the property is utilized for residential purposes, most lenders will consider it a residential piece of property, not necessarily a commercial piece. But it's an important thing to understand, and that's something you're going to want to talk with your individual lender in order to make sure that you're doing things the right way. But why does it matter what the type of property is? Why does it matter whether it's residential or commercial? Well, it all boils down to cost. Now, the cost that I'm talking about here is the cost of capital, specifically the capital that you're using to acquire the underlying property. When we're talking about commercial properties, the lenders in those environments tend to charge a much higher interest rate than they do for residential property. And the reason for that is the risk that the bank is taking is higher, in that underlying businesses have a high failure rate. And at the end of the day, the bank doesn't want to be on the hook for that risk. So the way they offset that risk is they charge more for those particular type of loans. The other thing that's interesting with regard to commercial loans is the terms that are associated with those loans are oftentimes a little bit less favorable than on the residential side of the spectrum. For instance, the entire term of the loan tends to be shorter. Most commercial loans will not extend beyond 20 years, meaning the amortization schedule that's utilized for that particular loan is a 20-year or less amortization schedule. The other thing that's interesting is they often will require a higher down payment, and they also may have a variable interest rate that kicks in at some period of time. For instance, they may do the first 5 years at a fixed interest rate, and at the conclusion of that fixed interest rate period, the interest rate that gets charged for that loan that's still outstanding becomes variable. All of these things factor into the potential higher cost for commercial loans. On the residential side, the risk tends to be a little lower for those lending institutions. Since the federal government is so incentivized to promote home ownership, there's also this backdrop through government programs that allow for home ownership at a much more favorable environment in order to essentially stimulate and motivate individuals to get involved in real estate. But when it comes to buying real estate for investment purposes, it's really interesting to understand how these different loan programs work and how they differ between getting a multifamily versus a single family. And let's jump into that now. When it comes to borrowing money for residential real estate, one of the most powerful programs that exists out there is something called the FHA loan. The FHA loan allows you to get access to capital in extremely favorable terms if we're talking about residential real estate. Remember when I talked about at the beginning the different types of real estate, residential versus commercial? As long as we're talking about 4 units or less in a particular building, you're considering the entirety of that building to be residential. Therefore, you can qualify as an FHA borrower based on the fact that that property that you're trying to acquire is actually going to be 4 units or less. It is residential. And as long as you reside in one of those units, you are able to then use the rental income from the remainder units to support that cost cost of capital. Let's break it down this way. Let's assume that you're going to buy a single family unit that you were going to reside in. You see, in order to take advantage of the FHA, you must live in it. It must be your primary residence for at least the first year. So let's assume you're going to buy a property. Let's say it's a $500,000 property, and you're going to use an FHA in order to acquire that particular property. The FHA down payment standards for your first acquisition is very low. It's only 3.5%. You would only require 3.5% for a $500,000 property. However, your personal income would have to be able to support the debt that's outstanding on that particular property from a payment standpoint every single month. That's fine if your personal income can support that, but a lot of individuals may not be able to do that. However, if you simply add multiple units to the property, let's say you could acquire a $500,000 property that is a multi-unit property. Now again, I recognize that those properties are probably few and far between for some of you, because depending on where you live, property values could have gone through the roof over the course of the past 2 to 3 years. And in fact, there are some areas that there's no signs that that's slowing down at all, while other areas may be challenged. But either way, if you have the ability to get into a multifamily unit, live in one of those units as your primary residence so that you can take advantage of everything else that the FHA loan program offers to you, you're able to then use the other rental income from the other units to support that cost of capital. Let's assume, again, you're acquiring a $500,000 multifamily property. Now again, the requirement, it must be your primary residence for at least the first year. So as long as you meet that standard and you meet some of the other standards the FHA puts in place, for instance, having a minimum credit score of 580 or above. In fact, you can go below 580 if you're able to give a larger down payment. But if you want the 3.5% down payment, you have to have a 580 credit score or greater. And then what the FHA program will allow you to do is they will allow you to use up to 75% of the rental income, either actual income or projected income based on the status of that particular property, as supporting that cost of capital. If you are looking at a property that is 3 to 4 units, you will also have to meet something called the self-sufficiency test. That simply just means that the property itself, by itself, through the rental income, the net operating income that's available for that particular property, that alone will support the debt repayment, meaning not even factoring a significant amount of your own personal income in. They're looking to make sure that the property itself can support the cost of capital outstanding. But as long as you meet those standards, it's pretty attractive. Why? Because now you potentially have the ability to acquire a property at even a higher value. Maybe it's not $500,000, maybe it's $750,000. Why? Because you have the potential of up to 3 additional sources of income over and above your own income that can support the potential loan that you would need to acquire that property. That is why it could be easier for you to acquire a fourplex than it could be for you to acquire a single family property, especially if we're talking about property in a similar pricing category. Because the standards that are set by the FHA, they're standards set based on residential use. And even if you're residing in one unit and getting commercial income because you're renting that property out, those other units out, that's still a residential property in the eyes of the FHA. And therefore, you can qualify for much better loan standards and terms than otherwise you would acquire for just a single family. Because at the single family level, you still have the same credit environment, meaning you still have to have a 580 credit score or above in order to get that 3.5% down payment environment. Or again, if you're able to go up to 10%, you can get down anywhere north of 500 with regard to your credit score. But beyond that, on that single family, they're going to be looking at your own personal income as the only source of income. And they're going to be looking at your debt to income ratio, and they're going to be factoring that all in to determine whether or not you can actually qualify for that particular loan. So when it comes down to it, the simplest answer is it's simply easier to qualify for a fourplex because you have much more income that can be used to support your case for getting the loan. Now, a lot of my followers on social media have been asking me lots of questions based on that video that I mentioned earlier, and I think this is an ideal time to start to address some of them for you. Let's talk about probably the most prevalent question I get is, based on current market conditions, is it really feasible to go out there and leverage loans in order to acquire multifamily properties? Because property values have skyrocketed in a lot of different areas around the country. And the reason for that is just over demand in those particular areas and undersupply. And there's a logical reason for that. A lot of people who are sitting on properties over the course of the past 2 to 3 years when interest rates were extremely favorable, they went out and refinanced those particular properties, right? They have very low, potentially very low cost of capital, meaning they refinanced at low interest rates. Now, if they were to sell that property, meaning taking a house that has very favorable interest rates and sell that property, they have to go somewhere. And the current mortgage rates standing at the moment tend to be pretty high. So therefore, there's not a lot of incentive for those particular individuals to go out and just sell property willy-nilly. Now, don't get me wrong, transition events happen and people will be selling, and that's why properties do come onto the market from time to time. But that is one of the factors that is impacting home prices right now. But when it comes to whether or not this is feasible, the real question I have back to you is how determined are you to take advantage of a wealth building strategy? And what I mean by that is, what is your level of flexibility? Are you willing to change your current circumstance and essentially create some bit of uncomfortability in order to build a life you truly desire? Because the reality is this, you're comfortable likely where you are at the moment, because if you weren't, you probably already would have made a change. The real question is, how uncomfortable are you willing to get? As an example, are you willing to move from a single family home, which you may live in now, into a multifamily? Because there are a lot of dynamics that go into that decision-making process, and I totally understand that. But doing that, moving from a single family to a multifamily, could give you the groundwork for building real financial freedom down the road. So whether or not the market conditions make it feasible, the real question is, how comfortable are you going to be with being uncomfortable? That could result in finding a market that's not your current market, meaning not finding property in your current area. How flexible are you willing to be to relocate? And I totally understand that that's not always feasible for a lot of people. But if you are in a position where you're able to go to where the market actually says that you can get really good deals at the moment, well then that's something you need to reasonably consider. Ultimately, though, that's not my decision to make. That's going to be your decision to make. You have to determine how uncomfortable are you willing to be in order to create the life you truly desire. Another common question I've been getting is the differences between using an FHA versus a VA loan or versus something like a DSCR loan. Well, let me say this. The FHA and VA loans are oriented towards residential property, non-commercial use. And what I mean by that is it's not really deemed to be an exclusive investment loan. Whereas the DSCR loan, well, that is exclusively oriented towards investment. Doesn't mean you have to buy a commercial piece of property. You can still buy residential property with a DSCR loan. It's just that loan is being issued to you as an investor for property, not necessarily as the resident in property. So a DSCR loan does not come with any residency type of requirements, meaning you're not required to make that property your primary residence for any period of time. Whereas both the VA loan and the FHA loan, they come with a residency requirement, meaning both of those loan programs require you to live in that acquired property for at least 1 year. And the third most common question I tend to get centers around this word risk. Like, what risks are inherent in this particular strategy? There are a lot of them. You have risks like the risk of vacancy. A tenant does not get put into the property, therefore there's no income to assist in the supporting of that cost of capital. You could also have the risk of getting the wrong tenant. And what do I mean by wrong? A wrong tenant is an individual tenant that is not going to care for the property with due care that is required of tenants, right? They're going to damage that property. They're going to mistreat that property, and therefore you are going to have the cost to remediate that damage at the expiration of the lease. You could also get a tenant that's wrong in that they just don't pay their rent, right? You have a tenant in there and they're not actually doing what they're supposed to do. They've breached the contract, breached the agreement. But in some states, it could be very difficult to get that tenant out of your property. Not necessarily impossible, but it could be difficult. It could be costly, meaning you may have to go through a litigation process in order to get them evicted. There are other costs that are associated with this as well. But my question to you is, what is the cost of not doing it? If you don't put yourself into a position where you're actually working towards financial freedom in your life, that's a cost too. There's risk associated with that too. And you have to determine with what you're going to do in your life, what risks are you going to take? Are you going to take the risks where you avoid risk and therefore only get what is available to those who avoid risk entirely? Or are you going to take risks, prudent, calculated risks, in order to get outcomes? What I can say is this: for me, most of the things that I truly desire are on the other side of risk. They're on the other side of caution, because you have to be willing to extend yourself and take risks in order for you to have this potential of profit. Because when everything boils down to the sum of its parts, profit is a direct result of the risk you're willing to take. If you've liked this particular video and you're interested in learning about a variety of different financial planning topics, well, be sure to drop those topics that are most interesting to you so that I can be sure to cover them in the future.